In this lecture, we're going to be talking about sleeping and dreaming. Sleep is really one of a number of biological rhythms. A biological rhythm is a periodic fluctuation in your physiological processes. You're not aware of them, but they're running behind the scenes, and some of them are on an annual basis or a seasonal basis, like the hibernation cycle of bears. Other rhythms are on a 28-day cycle, just as human menstruation is for human females. And other biological rhythms occur on a 24-hour cycle, the way that sleeping does. There's some other 24-hour cycles, like cortisol, for instance. It's a hormone that is involved in stress. If you're chronically stressed out, then you may have elevated levels of cortisol circulating through your body. And if your cortisol levels don't fall naturally as they're supposed to throughout the day, then that could lead to insomnia at night. Biological rhythms, such as the sleep-wake cycle, are controlled by a particular nucleus in the hypothalamus. That nucleus is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Supra meaning above, chiasm for the optic chiasm. So this is a nucleus that is just above the optic chiasm, which we learned about in the chapter on sensation. Now, sitting above the optic chiasm, which is where those fibers cross from one side of the eye heading to the opposite side of the brain, sitting above that point in your visual system is a good place to be if you're going to be responsible for the sleep-wake cycle, because the sort of switch that triggers the sleep-wake cycle, if you will, is light. That is, we tend biologically to feel sleepy when it gets dark and to awake when it gets light. Now, Thomas Edison sort of screwed with our processes in that we now keep the lights on artificially after it has gotten dark outside. And that's a way in which we tweaked our physiology. Still wants to go to sleep when it gets dark, but we don't know it's dark if we're sitting in the house with the lights on. And so it's not surprising that a lot of humans suffer from insomnia and not enough sleep. Occasionally, your biological clock could get desynchronized or thrown off of its regular schedule. If you've ever flown across the country, then you may have experienced jet lag. And the further you fly and the more you've changed time zones, the worse it is. So if you fly from California to the East Coast, where it's 3 hours ahead, then you're probably going to get a little bit of jet lag. The other way in which you could screw up your sleep-wake cycle is with shift work. So if you work what's known as the graveyard shift, where maybe you start work like at midnight and finish work at 4 in the morning or 6 in the morning or something like that, then you may be desynchronizing your cycle. And that actually can result in increased accidents. There's more difficulty for people that have sleep schedules that are set off by people who work the graveyard shift tend to have higher incidences of illness. They have to take more pharmacological drugs for various kinds of illnesses and various disorders. They struggle to stay awake when they are at work. They have a lot of impaired functioning in their physiology. And something else that can throw off your clock is just insomnia. If you don't get enough sleep, then that can disrupt your cycle for a few days. You can reset the clock, as I suggested when we were talking about biological clocks in general and the suprachiasmatic nucleus. You can reset it with bright light. So that's one way to reset your clock. And if you happen to be flying across country, you can actually reset your biological clock in order to adapt for work or a vacation by taking melatonin, which is a chemical that we naturally produce, but you might be a little bit off in what time it's being released compared to what time it is in the city you've just arrived in. Now, it's kind of a silly question in a way, but the question of why do we sleep is an important one. And I've looked at a variety of intro to psych books over the many years that I've taught this class, and in none of them do they give what I think is the best reason for sleeping, and that is it feels good. At the end of the day, it's sort of nice to just shut everything else off and everything out of your mind and go to sleep. And so if somebody told me you could get by without ever sleeping again and you'd feel fine and you'd be able to function and all your physical processes would be okay, I would say, I think I'd still like to get some sleep. It just feels good. And the benefits of sleep are clear. It definitely helps with our physical and mental functioning. If you don't sleep well, then a lot of times you suffer at work or at school. In fact, research shows that sleep deprivation leads to crabby moods, slowed thinking, and decreased motivation. People who are sleep deprived don't always recognize that they're sleep deprived and that their sleep deprivation is impairing them significantly. So one of the things that sleep does for us is it restores our brains and bodies. And the idea is that over the course of a day, we're depleting something in our brain and body, and that gets restored and reset by sleep. Another explanation is called the adaptive or evolutionary function. What that means is basically that we sleep at night when it's dark and humans don't see well. As support for the adaptive theory of sleep, you can look at the amount of sleep that different animals get throughout the night. And humans, on average, we get about 8 hours of sleep per night. But what about some other animals like horses? They get just under 3 hours of sleep per night. And bats, they get over 19 hours of sleep per day. If you look at that range of sleep that different animals get, you might ask yourself, why do some animals get 3 hours of sleep and some animals get nearly 20 hours of sleep? Well, the animals that are prey tend to sleep the least. If you're a horse and you fall asleep, you're just this big old sleeping thing in the middle of a field, let's say, that's vulnerable to getting eaten by an animal that's a predator. So animals that are large and clumsy tend to not sleep very much. So cows, sheep, those kinds of animals don't get a lot of sleep. Now, you might then ask, why does a rabbit get to sleep 8.4 hours when we only get 8 on average? Well, rabbits, even though they're prey, they're eaten by all kinds of other animals like coyotes, for instance, they can have the luxury of sleeping about as much as we do because they can burrow into holes and behind things and under things. They tend to burrow when they sleep, so they're a little bit safer in that regard. Now, animals that are the hunters, and particularly the hunters that hunt at night, they tend to have a lot of sleep during the day. So obviously one animal in which they have a very different sleep schedule from humans is the cat. And so if you have a cat, it's quite likely that, especially if the cat's very young, that if you go to work or school all day and the cat's left alone, he's going to be sleeping all day, and then late at night when you're trying to sleep, that's when the cat's going to be active. And he's going to get up and maybe pester you because he wants to play. So you have to have stuff for the cat to do, some toys and perches and things where the cat can run around and play and jump from thing to thing, so that when you get home from work, the cat is wiped out from all of the good stuff that he has at home to play with. But that's the idea, that animals are going to sleep when they are trying to stay out of harm's way. So humans, not being very good with vision at night, we might as well sleep when it's dark out. Another reason that people sleep is for growth and development. And if you look at sleep over the lifespan, babies sleep the most and elderly people sleep the least. So the assumption is that for growing and developing, you need a lot of sleep for that to take place. Another reason we sleep is to aid our memory. If you study something that's very difficult and then you go to sleep and even dream about what you've just studied, that actually helps with your memory of the information. So the very best thing you could do after a really intense period of studying for some class that's difficult is to go to sleep. And that works the best for stuff that's not just rote memorization, but rather more like problem solving. So if you had a physics class and you had to learn how to apply certain theories to problem solving, then that kind of thing you'd study for and then take a nap so you can help consolidate all of those memories while you sleep. So again, like I said, sleep deprivation can lead to all kinds of problems such as a decrease in alertness or cognitive performance. That means when you're driving or when you're doing a task at work, an inability to sustain attention at work or in school. Your brain activity is lessened after a poor night of sleep, and you make poor decisions when you haven't slept enough. So normal sleep consists of a series of stages that occur in order and cycle in predictable ways throughout the night. So stage 1 sleep is a very light stage of sleep. And if you look at the sort of picture behind the text on this screen, you see the various stages of sleep on the top. It says stage 1, stage 2, and so on. And the little line that's kind of going up and down, zigzagging, is your brain waves during each of those stages of sleep. And stage 1 and stage 2 is known as sort of fast wave sleep, in the sense that there's a rapid cycling in those waves. And then stages 3 and 4 are known as slow wave sleep because of the larger space between each cycle that you see in the brain activity. So stage 1 is a very, very light stage of sleep. If I woke you up when you were in stage 1 sleep, you would probably say that you weren't sleeping. So if I say, hey, wake up, are you asleep? You're probably going to say, no, I wasn't asleep. Why are you bothering me? But in fact, you probably were in that earliest stage of sleep. It's when your brain activity is starting to slow down, and it's when you've just sort of gotten into bed, relaxed, your eyes have shut, and it takes a various, some people, their head hits the pillow and they're out. Other people, it can take a half hour or more to kind of move from stage 1 into the deeper stages of sleep. In stage 2 sleep, there are these sudden increases in wave frequency in your brain waves. They're called sleep spindles. So you see those little bursts of activity in those waves at the top under the heading stage 2. Those are sleep spindles. I like to think of those as being white noise that your brain creates to help you move into the deeper stages of sleep. Now, some of you who are listening to this, you might actually create your own sleep spindles in a sense. That is, you might be using something as a noisemaker to help you fall asleep. So if you live somewhere and it's noisy, let's say, like I used to in college live in a dormitory for about a year, and it was noisy every single night. Every night there was some party at the frat houses that were behind the dormitory, or neighbors in one of the other rooms in my dormitory. It was super noisy, and the only way I could fall asleep under those conditions was to turn on a fan. So we had a little room fan, the kind that you plug in, and my roommate and I would plug that in at night, and it would go shh and make a swishing noise. And thankfully, the swishing noise helped to block out all of the background stuff. And in a sense, that's the function of stage 2 sleep. It's kind of helping you ease into those deeper stages. And many of you may use a television or radio or some other device in order to help you move into the deeper stages of sleep. Now, I will caution you that anything that you do when you're setting down to go to sleep that creates light can ultimately interfere with your sleep and the quality of your sleep. So a television or an iPad or a computer, if you use all of that kind of stuff in bed and you have insomnia, then you should probably stop using that stuff. If you don't have insomnia, carry on. Now, as we move into the deeper stages of sleep, stages 3 and 4, the brain waves slow down. And the difference between stage 4 is essentially the percentage of those big, large waves that are called delta waves. They're slow frequency, high amplitude waves. When you're in stages 3 and especially 4, it is very hard to wake up somebody who's asleep. And if you were awakened, say you set an alarm clock for 3 a.m. because you had some important thing to do very early that day. Maybe you're going on a trip or something, and you wake up at 3 a.m., you're going to be disoriented and confused. For instance, one of my dogs has epilepsy, and the very first time he had a seizure, and in fact every seizure he's had since, has always happened between the hours of 3 and 4 a.m. And the very first time he had a seizure, I heard one of my 2 dogs take off running, jump off of the bed, and fly under the bed. It was the most bizarre thing that had ever occurred for me at 3:30 in the morning. And I wondered if maybe they got into some sort of fight, like one might have got snappish with the other if they bumped them in the middle of the night. I had absolutely no idea what was happening. I was just rudely awakened. I was confused and disoriented, and I looked under the bed, and my dog had flopped over onto his side and started having a seizure. And I was just staring at him going, "What is going on? What's happening?" And it took me a while to say to myself, "Oh my goodness, my dog is having a seizure," and to kind of get up out of bed and realize that I should probably take him in that day to see the veterinarian. But it was kind of hard to kind of cope with it. And it always happens at this time of the night when I'm not at my best at all. And so it's always very stressful. Now, once you cycle through from stages 1, 2, 3, and 4 in order, you then enter what is called rapid eye movement sleep. It's called rapid eye movement sleep, or REM for short, because your eyes move back and forth in their sockets, and you can see somebody who's falling asleep with their eyes moving back and forth. It's very often during rapid eye movement that people are dreaming and having those dreams that are very vivid, very story-like, rather than the mundane dreams where you're washing dishes or something in non-REM sleep. And during the REM sleep, your dreams are you're flying and you zoom in somewhere to rescue somebody. They're those kinds of vivid, crazy sorts of dreams. So you cycle through stages 1 through 4 and then go into REM sleep. And then you cycle back to stage 2, 3, 4, and REM sleep, and you do that multiple times throughout the night. So as I indicated to some degree earlier, the way we sleep changes across our lifespan. So here's lifespan over here from a newborn baby up to people who are in their 90s. And you see that overall, spend the most time sleeping and less time awake, whereas it changes over time so that older people are spending more time awake and less time asleep. And the direction of kind of whether you're a morning lark or a night owl, that changes over time to where older adults tend to wake up earlier in the morning and they start to go to sleep earlier in the evening. So I mentioned that you start out awake and then you go into stage 1 sleep, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and then you cycle back. And there's various cycles throughout the night, and each of those tends to last about 90 to 100 minutes per cycle. So in a typical night, you're going to spend most of your time in stage 1 and 2 sleep, and some of the time in stage 3 and 4 sleep, and some of the time in REM sleep. Now there's a variety of abnormal patterns to sleep that some people suffer from. So we looked at normal sleep, those stages that we went through. Now we'll talk a little bit about some of the abnormal ways in which people have a bad night's sleep. Insomnia is a sleep disorder featuring consistent difficulty falling asleep, staying asleep, or achieving high-quality sleep. If you have insomnia, you can't sleep. No matter how much advice you get from friends or family, what pills you take, you just can't get a consecutive several days of good, decent sleep. So you're going to probably feel awful, not just during the night, but also the next day. So different kinds of insomnia can be associated with other kinds of disorders. Like some people who have insomnia are depressed patients, and the type of depression might indicate the type of insomnia that you have. So some people that are depressed have what's called an onset insomnia. That is, they have difficulty falling asleep. And in other kinds of depression, people have what's called termination insomnia, which means they can fall asleep normally, but they wake up too soon. That's also, that sort of termination insomnia is a consequence of drinking alcohol. If you get kind of wasted and fall asleep, you're probably going to wake up too early and not be able to go back to sleep. So it's sort of a myth to say that alcohol helps you sleep, because it does not help you get high quality sleep. So unfortunately, insomnia is rather common. About a third of people will get some symptoms of insomnia on occasion, and probably 10% have full-blown insomnia on a regular basis. Now, sleepwalking and other things that happen during sleep, like sleep talking or getting up and sleep eating, usually eating and walking going hand in hand, that happens usually in stages 3 and 4. It's happen when you're in the deep stages of sleep. If you kind of wake somebody up who's sleepwalking or sleep talking, they're going to be a little bit confused and not really realize what had just happened or how they got into a different room or down the street. And so you kind of have to maybe help them, guide them back to their bed where they can get back to sleep. Another type of sleep disorder is a night terror, which is different from a nightmare. So sleep terrors are distinct. Like nightmares are just scary dreams, and they're kind of common. We all have some sort of nightmare about failing a test, or nightmares tend to happen during REM sleep, but sleep terrors tend to happen during non-REM sleep. And it's essentially similar to a panic attack that you have while you're sleeping. It involves intense fear. It could involve screaming, sweating, rapid breathing, and a pounding heartbeat. It usually happens within the first 90 minutes of sleep and lasts just a few minutes. And when it's over, the sleeper can often go back to normal sleep and can't remember it later. But it will definitely disturb others who sleep with you or sleep in a nearby room. It tends to also be a little bit more common to happen in people with psychological problems such as anxiety or depression. And it typically happens in childhood and goes away when children enter adolescence or early adulthood in many, many cases. Narcolepsy is another sleep disorder. You can think of it as sleep attacks, where you have an attack of almost sleep in the middle of the day. It's rare. It doesn't occur very often in the general population, and when it does happen, people are typically teens or early adults when they first develop narcolepsy. The person goes from completely alert to completely asleep almost immediately, just like a immediate attack of sleepiness. And their muscle tone will be limp. They will sag in their seat, and some people have even flopped to the ground. And they're often triggered by strong emotional reactions like laughter or surprise. In fact, it can happen in other animals. I knew of a dog that had narcolepsy, and his owner scattered a bunch of treats on the floor for the dog, which made the dog get super excited. Oh, goody, I get all these treats. And then he had an attack of narcolepsy and went to sleep. And then when he woke up, he saw all the treats and had another attack of narcolepsy. So it's kind of a difficult thing to deal with if you suddenly fall asleep at school or at work, or God forbid, while you're driving or something like that. And another sleep disorder that is a little bit more common, it happens in about 3% of middle-aged adults, and more often than not in men than in women, and particularly obese men. And that is sleep apnea. It's a sleep disorder caused by interruptions of breathing that cause you to wake up, and you might not even know that you're waking up. The interruption of breathing that causes awakening could be so brief that it's happening multiple times throughout the night and you're not aware of it. So you're not conscious enough when you wake up to realize that you've woken up a bunch of times during the night. But you probably are going to feel very sleepy the next day, and the sleepiness is going to start to seem normal because it happens to you every single night that you go to sleep. But what happens is that in your upper airway, there is a little piece of tissue that kind of falls back and blocks the flow of breathing in and out of your lungs. And that's kind of what leads to your stopping breathing. So typically what you'll get prescribed if you have this is a machine called a CPAP that puts a continuous amount of positive air pressure into the back of your throat to keep that little flap of tissue open while you sleep. Now there's a whole lot of maintenance to the CPAP, and it's very difficult to get people to be compliant with using it because it's not very sexy. So if you sleep with somebody else and you have to put this mask on every night, it's probably not the world's biggest turn on for your sleeping partner. And also it is a little bit cumbersome. So a lot of people will get prescribed the CPAP and then have difficulties with consistent use. But it actually is very important to use the CPAP if you're prescribed one, because there's a lot of data that show that things like heart disease and other more serious problems can happen if your sleep apnea goes untreated. So now that we've talked about sleeping, what about dreams? Here's some facts that you may not know about dreams. Dreams occur in real time. So if your dream feels like it went on for an hour, it probably did. Another fact is that your memory for a dream is best if we immediately awaken you during the dream. In the morning, you may have noticed that you say to yourself, oh my gosh, I had the craziest dream about my sister. I'm going to have to tell her about the crazy dream I had that she was in. And then later in the day, when you get a chance to talk to your sister, you're like, I had the craziest dream and you were in it, and I don't even remember what it was anymore. It was just really crazy and you were there. So if you really wanted to have a good memory for that dream, we'd have to wake you up while you're having it. Most of our dreams are very common. They're not the bizarre ones. The bizarre ones we tend to maybe remember a little bit better just because they are bizarre. Another fact about dreams is that all people dream. The people that say I don't dream just don't remember their dreams, but they definitely have them. There's a lot of data to suggest that other animals dream as well. Like you might see your dog or your cat flopped over on their side with their, feet twitching, or you might see their eyes moving back and forth as if they're having rapid eye movements. And you can probably assume that they are in fact dreaming during that time. People also have really bad long-term memory for dreams. So a dream that you had 4 days ago is probably forgotten. And that's actually really good news, I think, because if you remembered your dreams, you might start to get dreams confused with reality, and that could be a big problem. Now, there are some people that can control the course of their dream. So if they're sailing along in a boat and they're in kind of a swamp, and the person who's a lucid dreamer says, I don't want to be in a swamp, I want to be sailing on the ocean, they can suddenly change the course of their dream to be what they would like it to be. And some people are able to kind of train themselves to develop this ability to lucid dream. So why do we dream? There's a lot of people that think there's some underlying sort of secret message in dreams. Freud was famous for analyzing dreams and trying to look below the surface content of the dream to find the underlying content of the dream, which he felt had some sort of personal significance for people. But unfortunately, the bulk of the scientific data suggests that dreams don't usually have any deep underlying or secret meaning, but rather the best two theories of dreaming are the cognitive theory of dreaming and the activation synthesis theory of dreaming. In the cognitive theory of dreaming, the idea is that we dream because it helps us to process information and to solve problems. And some of the support for that type of theory is the idea that when students do study for complex problem solving, sorts of like if you learned a very difficult game that involved using various problem solving skills, and then you went to sleep and you were allowed to dream, you would have better retention of that problem solving ability when you woke up than if we interrupted you every time you were dreaming. Then you would be worse at solving those problems the next day. In the activation synthesis theory, the idea is that what's happening when you're dreaming is that your higher brain centers are kind of disconnected from the lower brain centers in the sense that you've got all kinds of random activity that's just firing away in your brain, and your higher level brain centers are trying to just make sense out of all of this stuff. So if your brain is just firing off stuff like my feet or the sky or turtles, then you might dream that you're flying through the sky on a giant turtle with big feet or something like that. So your brain sort of takes all of that raw data and turns it into a story. And the evidence for that are studies that show that when we wake you up while you're dreaming, you're better able to recognize patterns. So if I asked you to do a word association task, for instance, right after you've been dreaming, you're better able to make connections between words than if I woke you up when you weren't dreaming. And of course, I could hook you up to some equipment to look at your brain activity and see whether you're dreaming or not, and wake you up at appropriate times to see how you're able to handle information. And you're much better at making patterns when you're in the middle of dreaming. So are there hidden meanings in dreams? I'd say the short answer is no, that for the most part, the activation synthesis hypothesis has the most data to back it up. But the long answer is that we do have dreams about things, events, experiences that are important to us and specific to us. But usually in those cases, if you were held up at gunpoint and your car was stolen, you're probably going to have dreams about guns or cars or getting robbed because something significant happened to you in your life. So I don't think you need a psychoanalyst to tell you why you're having those dreams. It's kind of obvious. So we do dream about things that are important to us. But with that being said, I'm not sure that if you went and looked up the content of your dream in 10 different dream dictionaries, that you wouldn't find 10 different interpretations, all of which are basically guesswork. So the next lecture will be on another aspect of consciousness, and that is psychoactive drugs. That's all for today.